Good day. My name is Lesroy Williams. I am the Director General of the St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service. Today, we will be having a discussion on the St. Kitts and Nevis National Gender Equality Policy and Action Plan, which has been drafted by the Ministry of Gender Affairs, and a key person working on this national gender equality policy is Ms. Dwynette Eversley, who has been the consultant. Welcome, Ms. Eversley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you as well. Now, could you tell us something about yourself, a little background, and your engagement with the Ministry of Gender Affairs, especially in relation to the National Gender Equality Policy and Action Plan?
I have been very active in the Caribbean working on social development policies, and I have an excellent background with St. Kitts and Nevis, and I think this was the reason that the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs actually selected me from the candidates who had submitted to complete the policy, because the policy activity had started in 2019. I was part of the team working to develop the St. Kitts and Nevis youth policy that was successfully implemented. And as I was mentioning, my work with the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs on this policy is completing a phase two of the policy draft. Phase one had already been done through extensive consultations with sectors and NGO civil society agencies.
Okay, very interesting that we are having this discussion today on a national gender equality policy, especially where we see in our world that there is so much inequalities and inequities we are seeing, and one of these things it has to do with is gender. Now, what is a national gender equality policy? And what is the significance of a national gender equality policy?
Well, that is an excellent question and a huge bite. If I were eating a burger with that question, the whole burger would have been eaten. So now, gender equality and a gender equality policy, a policy to put it in very, in terms that everyone would understand, it's a blueprint. And what that means is that the government is committing in this blueprint to provide an equal footing for everyone's development that may have otherwise been hampered, impeded, not realized because of one being born, man or woman, boy or girl. So a gender policy provides an footing of equality for all. That is what a gender policy. And what I want to make clear is that St. Kitts and Nevis is part of the global agenda on for the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And you would know, Mr. Williams, that one of the universal principles of that Sustainable Development Agenda is gender equality. So this is part of the government's commitment to upkeeping its international obligations and upkeeping, staying on par with development to benefit men and women equally.
Yes. Now, you mentioned some keywords there. For example, gender equality. And then there are other times when people speak about gender equity. Could you define gender equality and gender equity and tell us what is the subtle difference between both terms?
I'm a purist, so I don't use gender equity at all. As you know, the basis for gender equality is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And women's rights are human rights. Gender equality is defined as a standard to be attained. So there is no guessing what gender equality is. It's a universal standard, an international standard. Gender equity is a very credible or is a very admirable. I prefer to use the word admirable, Mr. Williams. It's a very admirable expression of intent to be equal. But your idea of equity is not a standard idea of equity. And what UN Women has said is that when we talk about gender equity, it's still a subjective decision about what equity is for whom and when. Whereas equality is a standard and there is no subjective interpretation. So, in fact, what I want to make absolutely clear is even UN Women has said that they would always use the term gender equality. Furthermore, and this is not a lesson, but it's very important, it's a vital question because people talk about equity all the time. The concept of gender equality, and all of this is explained in the draft document because it is so critical. The concept of equality means substantive equality. If I provide a measure, equality means that it must be seen and achieved by men and women in law and in practice and in the actual results in people's lives.
Yes, you said that you are a purist. What do you mean by that? Because we often hear that word as well, gender parity.
I said I was a purist
A
because there are
purist,
some
not a
people who,
purist, a purist.
purist, no, pure, because there are some people who still speak to the question of equity. And in all my research, equity is a subjective concept. What you determine is equitable for me is not true and genuine equality.
Yes, but
And
Miss
as I
Eversley, when we
said,
speak,
it's not my interpretation, it's what UN Women has said. They no longer use the term gender equity. We speak of gender equality.
no, when we speak about equality, we are still not speaking in terms of, for example, you and I may not be equal in position, or we might not be equal in terms of the power that we wield, or we are not equal in terms of status in the society and so on. So, what exactly do we mean when we speak about equality? We're
Well,
equal
it
in
has
human
to,
dignity. We're equal
right,
in human dignity because we are all creatures of God.
right. And equal gender equality, as I said, is a human right, and we know the framework of rights as being inalienable. They should never and cannot be taken from you. They're indivisible, they're always there. So it's in the application of gender equality. And let me give an example. If jobs are available, for example, hypothetically speaking, in the defense force for um, divers, we will say that anybody who is qualified physically, mentally, and academically should be approved or have access to be trained, qualified, move up the ranks of divers. But in some cases, you may see only men may apply. And that is a case where gender perpetuates inequality. That is an example.
Good example. Now, sometimes when we hear about gender or the Ministry of Gender Affairs, people still have this stereotype that it's about women's rights and women's empowerment. When we speak about gender affairs, gender equality, are we only referring to women?
You know, that's an excellent question, and it is something the PS of the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs and the Director of Gender have confronted, because I am told that when the department was first established, it was called a Women's Bureau. And that has stuck in the national ethos as being representative only of the issues of men. But that is not the department I met, and that is not the focus of the work I met. And I think we have been very careful in drafting the gender equality policy and action plan to ensure, even in the definition of what gender equality means, to say that we are working to eliminate instances where gender inequality is perpetrated or perpetuated that affect boys and girls and men and women. And Mr. Williams, one of the key things we found in areas of gender equality and is the way the department has previously imaged their work. The face of the work has traditionally been women, and we know that there are issues of men where there is inequality in the society, and the policy looks at those issues.
Okay. Now, we often hear sometimes about the feminist movement. There's a feminist
Yes.
movement. Is the feminist movement the same thing when we speak about women's rights and women's empowerment? In other words, can we speak about gender equality? Can a woman speak about gender equality without aligning herself with the feminist movement, or to say, well, I am not a feminist, but yet I am in support of women's rights and women empowerment?
Mr. Williams, feminist is my favorite F word. And what a feminist, and I hope you are a feminist, Mr. Williams,
I am.
because again, this is so exciting because this is something we try to talk about in the policy. There is a glossary. The important thing is education, education, education. There's a glossary of terms that accompanies the gender policy. And that glossary of terms is supposed to be part of a media blitz, a public information and education, where we disabuse people about words and their meaning. A feminist is somebody who cares and is working for the equal rights of men and women. That
Ye-
is all a feminist is. The question you talked about women's empowerment, though, has also been a tricky issue. I mentioned earlier that one of the universal goals of the Sustainable Agenda 2030, the SDG goals, is gender equality. But they talk about gender equality and women's empowerment. And I like to throw that back and ask people across the course of history, or even if we look at the cultural, social, economic, political setting of our federation, where have men not been empowered? And so
Okay.
the issue is, yeah, so if we look at it that way, we understand why we have tagged in the importance of women's empowerment. Because promoting gender equality must be must be managed in tandem with promoting empowerment. Girls who leave school at 16 and grow into women at 26 and 30, who never have opportunities to complete their education or get certification, what type of jobs do they get? How do they take care of their children? How do we stop a cycle of poverty? That is all one very important component of the issue of women's empowerment. And that's
Yes.
only one.
Yes, and maybe you can shed some light on how culture and race and even religion have been used to perpetuate gender discrimination.
Again, an excellent question, and thank you for that. We have in the draft gender equality policy and action plan, 10 domains in which we have developed strategies, actions, that should be, should, excuse me, build a culture of equality and actions of governments and civil society, etc. And the first of those policy domains speak of agents of socialization. And we drill that down to mean culture, the family, religion, and fourth is your domain, Mr. Williams, the mass media. Because we know that gender is a social construct, we are told that boys should do certain things, girls should do certain things, women should do certain things, men should do certain things. In the St. Kitts and Nevis society, the man is the breadwinner. He brings home the bread. He is the provider for a family. In societies in Scandinavia, men stay home and take care of their children. And that does not affect how people view their manhood or their ability to care for themselves or their family. But in our culture, that people will say, really? No. The man needs to go out there and work. The woman stays home and take care of the children. And it's a matter of educating that there are alternatives for the better, for so that everyone. It's a concept of wellness that we are trying to create. Men don't go to the doctor when they feel ill. Men don't like generally to seek health affirming behaviors. And this is one of the issues we found out when we were doing the some consultations and some research related to the issues of men's health-seeking behaviors. And that's a cultural thing. Men are strong, they're resilient, they don't need to go to the doctor. And still, there are issues that could be avoided and prevented if men go to the doctor on a regular basis. So these are minor, not minor, some, these are some of the issues that stood out more prominently in the policy, and there are others that deal with religion. You know, Mr. Williams, some time ago I went to Nevis, and there was a gender forum, a one-day forum. And I was shocked, but not shocked to hear a participant saying that she has issues with her husband, including infidelity issues. And she was told that these are things you pray over and you cannot leave your husband because it's not something that is, accepted because in religion. So I'm saying these are some issues that still need to be confronted, and I don't want to offend anybody from the religious community. I am just repeating what was shared in a forum that I attended. And so I think, based on what the Department of Gender Affairs has already said, there is supreme enthusiasm with the religious community in St. Kitts and Nevis to work more strategically to support the development of more healthy behaviors in families, healthy behaviors that support the doctrine of religion and that also support women's empowerment and gender equality.
Of course, you know that religion, Christianity, was born in a very patriarchal age and culture. And some people still use the Bible to perpetuate gender discrimination. Certain passages in the Bible that speak about the man being the head of the household and that the woman must be submissive to her husband and all of those kinds of things. Some men still use that to subjugate women to an inferior role within the home. Now, as time progresses, we must become enlightened and to realize that that sort of a thinking, that patriarchal type of thinking, was of a particular culture and a particular age, and that we have moved on, and society needs to move on in terms of gender equality. Miss Eversley, you spoke about men and health. And I am sure that that is a part of the gender policy because that's very important. Health speaks to the view that we have of ourselves and our bodies and how we treat our bodies. And that is an important part in terms of even human sexuality, the view that we have of our body. And we know in Caribbean society, for example, one of the issues with black men is that of prostate issues, prostate cancer. And sometimes you have men that say, oh, they're not going to the doctor to have any sort of a rectal examination to deal with their prostate because then they link that to part of themselves that they're not comfortable with, where they're saying, oh, no one is going to insert anything into my rectum because that is being gay and that sort of a thing.
Yes, it's a big issue, and you're quite right there. We have all these homophobic fears. We have fears about sexual identity and orientation. But the issue, I think, is we have fears. We have fears of finding out what may be happening with our bodies. We have fears of wondering how we will cope. And most of all, I think based on what the men that we spoke to mentioned to us, there is such a blitz of information for women about breast cancer and self-examination. And it's a national issue. Since I have been in St. Kitts, I have had my pink socks and my pink glasses and my pink t-shirt. So there's a whole awareness. So it's a normalized. Take care of your breasts, examine, seek help. But this normalizing of prostate cancer has not happened sufficiently so that men feel comfortable going out, seeking, getting the support from other men, which is important. You find that the women support groups, but the same kind of health systems for men. Men feel that this is not enough. So part of the policy speaks about normalizing the issues that affect men, prostate cancer, and also sexual dysfunction. Nobody talks about those things. And so, again, normalizing those things so that men are more confident and comfortable about seeking help and services.
Yes, while we were speaking in terms of women's right and women's empowerment, and now that we are speaking about male issues, there has been in recent times this terminology, I refer to it as, to counteract sort of women's empowerment and women's right in speaking about our males are being marginalized, our boys are being marginalized, and that there must be men rights. And we see it a lot in terms of education. We're hearing that you have more female graduates at universities, more women now who are more educated. And education, of course, gives you power and it gives you independence and it gives you freedom in terms of how you think and an ability to basically move up on the social ladder. And is it that now that men feel threatened by this? Has the pendulum swung in a particular way in terms of, but yet not shifted enough? Because still women may be doing most of the work and so on, but yet not getting credit for it. So what are we talking here about in terms of male marginalization and men's rights?
That is a very important question, and I would like to suggest, and it's already part of the gender policy, there needs to be a much, much more discussion about this. And because it's sometimes a reductive discussion and reduces the concept of gender equality. And I position the discussion by asking a question. Where have boys or men been denied access to education, jobs, economic opportunities? And these are some, where in the society in St. Kitts and Nevis do we have evidence that there are opportunities and access in the society for social, political, economic advancement that are being closed off to boys and men? And so you pause and you wait for the reflection, and then you realize that there are no such gaps or inaccess to men and boys. The difference is, why are men or why are boys for dropping out of the education system? Why are men not going into the teaching service, for example, where the Ministry of Education has already in their new policy um, thought about en- enhancing or increasing the number of men who become teachers, because you need that in a classroom setting. So those are the issues. Why are men and boys not accessing the opportunities that are available?
Is it that what a boy is seeing in the classroom are more females? And so it is now ingrained in him, or he thinks that teaching is a female profession.
Well, a teacher
And so
told me
therefore he
that it's
doesn't have
empowering.
the lot of male role models that are
That is a valid
teachers.
point. That is a valid point, and I believe, based on what I saw in the latest policy of the ministry, education policy for the federation, that that is being addressed. You need male role models in the classroom, etc., etc. Um, and that is a fair comment. There was another part of it that I wanted to address, and I completely forgot it. A senior moment, but it will come back to me. Again, based on the educational policy, as I have read it, there is an effort to um, recruit and retain more men in the education sector. But what I wanted to say is, when we were having this discussion with a group of men, including teachers and even with the Ministry of Education, it is felt that the the salary for teachers is not attractive, and men who enter the teaching service, perhaps because they need to work, do not stay. So there's a higher dropout rate when men find other jobs that pay more. Women may stay in the profession because they like to teach. So I think it's a matter of putting in some sort of measures to increase the retention, the recruitment certainly, and the retention of men. And the issue is, when I went to school, there may have been more men in the classroom, and that didn't impact me in one way or the other. So the issue that there will be a woman in a classroom that impacts boys differently, or to affect their well-being, that is again a discussion, a national discussion. You see, there are so many national discussions we need to have around gender equality and gender identities, um, to make this work, because it's not only what is on paper, it has to be part of practice.
Yes, you mentioned, or while we are speaking about gender and professions, that I think is a big area, because once ago, of course, it was thought that certain professions were not for women. And there were certain fields that men would get involved in. Today, that is sort of getting much better. But at the very same time, we still see those same stereotypes. I know that here in St. Kitts and Nevis, there has been a pitch to get people in the nursing profession. And one of the things I think preventing that is this whole idea of gender. That what people are seeing is that nursing is a female profession, and that males getting involved in a female profession would be sort of seen with a kind of a cock eye kind of thing. And it's a cultural thing too, because in some places you have more males that are nurses. For example, perhaps in the Philippines.
Exactly. And you're right about that. It's a cultural thing. The issue of nurturing and taking care of elders and children have been long perceived as the role of women in our society. And in fact, the entire debate on gender equality and gender policies now talk about gender and the care economy, monetizing or putting a value to the amount, to the time and the effort of caring for children, caring for elderly parents, etc. And that is another issue. But what you described is an issue that we found, and there is a policy objective that speaks to increasing the number of men in nursing. I was advised as part of the research that the male nurses in our society are from Cuba and from the Philippines. I was even told that there are issues where people are taking care of elderly parents at home and they prefer that their male nurse to deal with a male parent or relative, and there is not adequate amount of these. And it's a matter of having the ministry examine and provide incentives for men to enter the profession.
Yes. Ms. Eversley, let us move on to gender and violence. Because we know that with gender equality, and especially sometimes women, or it was thought that women are the fairer sex and the weaker sex, that it makes it easier to perpetrate violence against the weaker sex or perceived weaker sex, that is women. And we've had a lot of cases of gender violence in terms of rape, sexual harassment, especially within the workplace, from men in powerful positions and harassing women who many times keep silent because they're afraid of the backlash, of the retaliation, of losing their jobs. They don't feel empowered enough to come forward and to speak out against this type of sexual harassment, this type of sexual violence towards them. And we have so many cases in society of powerful men. Recently, we've had the case, in New York and so on. How does the policy really speak to that?
The elimination of violence against women and human security is one of the policy domains. And this policy domain has the goal of implementing a multi-sectoral public health approach to prevent, reduce, and treat gender-based violence as gender transformative national development. And I repeat, gender transformative national development that benefits boys and men and women and girls equally. And that nomenclature, that language is to address what you are just talking about, the the perception that there is an opportunity to target somebody in a violent manner because they are man or woman or boy and girls, because that. And so I know the government has already done, and the ministry, including the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs, a lot to look at the prevention, punishment, and eradication of violence as a public health concern. There's already the domestic and sexual violence complaints and response protocol. The government has been working towards an intentional injury surveillance system. And the gaps that have been found on the basis of research and on the basis of the government's reporting to the Committee on the Convention and the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women shows that there are actions that are still to be taken on sexual harassment that you mentioned in the workplace. And violence, as you know, Mr. Williams, is emotional also and psychological. It's denying financial support in a family or in a home environment until certain things are done, or certain actions are complied with that may not seem right, that are not right. And this is so it's a matter of action and strategic actions, but it's a matter of legislation to cover the gaps that exist.
Yes, because of course, people are afraid, there is fear, and it has to do with abuse of power, power relations, especially when it comes to gender, negotiating power, domination, and all of those things that really go against gender equality, which break down gender equality. We have seen and we have heard, and the evidence has been there, that even during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is ongoing, that there have been increased incidences of domestic violence, abuse, and more often than not, that abuse is against women. Women locked down in a house with an abusive partner. And more vulnerable. More vulnerable. Additionally, we have seen that even in terms of employment and losing one's jobs because of the pandemic, women have been affected more than any other gender because of the type of jobs that they have in the hospitality sector, in factories, and things like that.
Those are all accurate. And the issue about the escalating violence against women in the while the pandemic continues to be with us has been well documented. UN Women Caribbean did a series of surveys about that and found and again substantiating that um, there were many more reports. There was an increase of reports of violence against women and domestic violence, violence that escalates so that children and families are also affected. And because of the toll that the pandemic continues to take on all of us, as you mentioned, in terms of economic opportunities being stripped, there's also violence against others, the elderly, older persons, persons who are persons with disabilities, persons who are in a position of vulnerability will be more affected when we have these extraordinary cases. And so that we also recognize this, and I think St. Kitts and Nevis will be one of the first countries in the Caribbean to do this because of the time in which the policy has been created. So the policy also provides a consideration for what are the gender dynamics of the COVID, the continued prevalence of the COVID virus, the virus in these societies, and how it affects us socially, politically, economically, environmentally. What are the tolls on people? And what do we need? What are the gendered aspects that we need to provide for when we are seeking recovery and resilience of boys and girls and men and women?
Yes. Now, Ms. Everett, let's move on to the employment and remuneration. Equal work for equal pay. And
Yes.
that is one of the things in the workplace where you may have inequalities with respect to work done and a person's salary with respect to gender. A woman might hold the very same job, but yet her male counterpart is being paid more than she is.
Well, that is very true. And we know already that poverty among women is a fact, and it's linked to multiple roles and responsibilities. And within that, the fact that women may not ascend the ladder of, corporate well-being or corporate attainment or attainment in public life because they have the multiple roles and responsibilities. But interestingly, and St. Kitts has a wonderful, because the based on what the research, let me backtrack. Based on the research, we know that there's equality in payment in the public sector across all levels. And this is also true in the political domain, where all ministers, whether you're male or female, you get the same salary, apart from, of course, the salary for a prime minister, which has always been different. However, the research that was presented, the primary and the secondary research, speak to instances in the private sector in the Federation, as you have described, when women and men are performing the same functions, but women may get less. And it's an issue of working with the private sector to address those disparities. Yeah,
Oh,
because it is known, it is documented, it was presented as part of a report to the ILO. And so it's not a matter of hushing it up or pretending that it does not exist, but really working to eradicate those practices.
yes. Okay, now the reproductive rights. There has been a link to women's rights and reproductive rights. The right over my body. And in most Caribbean countries, of course, you know, abortion is illegal. I remember this matter being addressed some years ago at a women's conference that was held in Beijing. And the whole thing about reproductive rights came up, but the laws of many countries prohibit things like even an abortion. What is your take on this?
That's an interesting question, and all policy goals and strategies conform with the laws of the Federation. We know that in addition to the issue of access to terminations and abortion, there are other gendered factors that are evident in the status of sexual and reproductive health in our society. And these manifest as inadequate sex education, women's unequal power to negotiate condom use, unprotected sex with partners, the early sexual initiation of girls and boys, trauma associated with menstruation, increased incidence of STIs and HIV, AIDS. And we know that women and girls who face higher levels of risk in their lives are also likely to face more significant risks of unintended pregnancy. The last reporting of the teenage pregnancy in the Federation was still considered high by the CEDAW committee. 15% of all births for the reporting period that the ministry submitted their report on this aspect were teenagers. 15% of all births were to teenagers. And that's not a static figure, Mr. Williams. We consider who are the fathers of these children that are being born to teenagers. And in most cases, we are told that they are not teenage boys. So, what are the other issues related to those pregnancies and the issues that the girls who become pregnant will face and the children? So, sexual and reproductive health, relates to all of those things and providing the education, the access, the knowledge, the ability to understand when you are being coerced to say no, to have that power to be able to tell somebody to seek support against early sexual initiation. And I mentioned condom use. All you men can have support in getting condoms through NGOs. There's never an issue that there is insufficiency. But even when you look at the National AIDS Program, for example, in 2017, there was an availability of 10,424 male condoms and only 1,000 female condoms available for distribution to support, um, safe sex, to reduce the incidence of HIV transmission, etc. So those are part of sexual and reproductive health and rights that still need to be strengthened.
Yes. Now, the Caribbean is seen as, and St. Kitts and Nevis being a part of that geographical space, as being very homophobic. And homophobic, but at the very same time, having a large underground when it comes to homosexuality. And the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, or queer community has not always found a home, have been made to feel very uncomfortable in terms of who they are, have been marginalized and excluded because of who they are, and at times violence being perpetrated against them, in some countries more than others, like in Jamaica. You have certain songs that are perpetrating violence towards a particular group of people in society. How does the policy speak to this in terms of people's human rights?
The policy provides to protect the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in the Federation to access, acquire, and enjoy services, supports, and facilities under all the priority goals and strategic actions of the gender equality policy, recognizing, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
Okay. Right. Now, we have another, there is a talk sometimes about what we refer to as, I'm having a senior moment like you had some time ago, but women in parliament and women in politics. In the Caribbean, politics has more been seen as male dominated. we've had women in politics, and we've had women that would have done very well in politics. Some of them would have become prime ministers and so on. But yet, in terms of women representation in politics, do you think it is adequate? And does the policy speak to that?
The
Because it goes
policy
back to
clearly,
power.
yes, the policy clearly speaks to it. It's you remember some time ago, Mr. Williams, there was a move to have a certain number, a certain portion of women in parliament across the world. It was not for St. Kitts and Nevis or the Caribbean, it was a global undertaking. And so the International Interparliamentary Union in their data shows that for St. Kitts and Nevis, 13.3% of parliamentarians are women. And so if the average that we were striving for is 30%, we may say that there is an underrepresentation of women in decision-making posts and in political bodies in St. Kitts and Nevis. By comparison, the highest in the region is, I think, Grenada, which is at 33.3%. And so the CEDAW Convention, to which St. Kitts and Nevis is party, and other international conventions and international obligations speak to increasing the participation of women in politics and removing the barriers or the lack of interest or the disenchantment of women about entering political life. And some of these are clearly recognized and spoken to in the policy in the policy. Because when we talk about politics, of course we talk about politics in terms of the political directorate and that executive decision making um,
Body.
body and participation of women in fulfilling the democratic mandates of a society. But we also look at policy in terms of decision making about high level policies that affect everybody. And women are underrepresented in decision making in other public institutions. Of the 429 officers of the in the police force, for example, 27.24.25%. That is the 25% are women, but there are no women in high command yet.
You mean here in
And
St.
so,
Kitts?
yeah, that's in
We
kids.
have
These are
had,
issues.
a woman in the high command, and she is still in a very senior post, Miss Merslin Hughes. She was in the high command, but now she's the chief immigration officer.
Okay, because
And
my quotation, what I quoted was based on the information I got from the Royal St. Kitts and Nevis Police Force that there are no women currently in high command.
not currently, but she was there
Okay,
before
okay.
her repositioning. However, what
So
we
we
do
have
have,
to, sorry.
what yes, what we do have also is that we have a number of women who are holding senior government positions as permanent secretaries and directors of departments here in the Federation. Of course, the
Yes.
cabinet secretary is also a woman. So while we may just have, I think it's just, we have the Deputy Speaker of the House is a woman. We have the Minister of Health, et al., who is also a woman. We have the Ministry of International Trade, Consumer Affairs, et al. She's also a woman. You know, so more and more we are getting there.
Yes. And I think there's genuine interest in getting there. Because
Yes.
let's also be real, we must also realize and confront why women may be hesitant about facing the electorate, about presenting themselves or political consideration. And also whether there are barriers in political parties for women who wish to present themselves to the electorate.
Yes. Okay. Now, we're almost running out of time, but we have this policy before us. It has to receive Cabinet's blessing,
Yes.
and then it has to go to Parliament, tabled in Parliament. But also there is an action plan, because you just can't have a policy and not an action plan. An action plan actually is how you are going to implement this policy. What can you tell us in terms of the implementation stage? What will it take? What sort of
It,
political will is necessary? What sort of a stakeholder involvement is needed?
that's the implementation is always the bugbear of policies. Wonderful documents that provide the regime for equality as is necessary in a gender policy that that responds to what a government wants to achieve in terms of their international commitments for women and men and boys in the relation of gender and rights and gender justice. Those will be there in the policy. But the implementation demands accountability from each sector. As I indicated previously, the policy has 10 domains. So it's health, education, sustainable development and the environment, or climate change and the environment, youth, decent work, and there's a whole range of issues under decent work, entrepreneurship, digital economy, the blue economy, etc., etc. And the agencies, the government agencies responsible, have to see themselves in a very accountable and responsible role for the policy, ensuring that their budgets, ensuring that their implementation aligns to the goals of the policy. And the policy provides for a gender management system, the establishment of gender focal points in all the ministries. I forgot the important agriculture ministry because the issue of women in agriculture and fisheries and food security it's vastly important. So all these agencies in the public sector working as gender focal points, monitoring that actual benefits are reaching those who need to be reached. And we didn't even talk about the special groups that were provided for in this policy, including people with disability, elder persons, youth, etc., etc. But that is what the action plan sets out. Who is responsible for what? Because we envisage, that there will be annual reporting to Parliament once the policy is passed on the status of implementation and the benefits that are being received and felt by people. And that is why there's also such an important part of the policy, a part of the implementation framework that relates to communication and information. A policy is not a silent document that resides with government agencies
Right.
only. The people have to be aware of what is available, they have to be educated. We spoke about some of the areas where we need education and information to disabuse certain ways of thinking about gender equality and empowerment. And this is all part of the action plan, the strategy of accountability.
Yes. Now, one of the areas that I failed to mention, Miss Eversley, is that of migrant women and the disadvantage that they're placed at. For example, we may have women coming into St. Kitts. St. Kitts is now becoming a melting pot of all kinds of people coming here to work and to live, and women might be at a disadvantage in the sense not being able to find work or getting menial jobs, or even because they can't find work and so on, getting involved in areas such as prostitution.
That's a very important point, Mr. Williams, because it's in 2015, the data tells us that there were 7,443 migrants living in St. Kitts and Nevis as permanent residents. So that figure would have gone up, and that's about 10% of the population, which is a lot. Over 10% of the population, and that's a lot. And we already know, based on regional and global data, we already know that there are vulnerabilities of migrant girls and women. And those vulnerabilities relate to gender-based violence, sexual abuse, forced prostitution, and trafficking. And of course, the government of St. Kitts has already taken action to protect the rights of migrant workers and members of their families under the applicable UN convention. And so the policy has as a goal that needs to be interrogated by the practitioners. It provides broad steps to integrate migrant girls and women, men and boys in the gender equality agenda so that they are valued, contributing members of society. Because we really want social cohesion. It's gender equality, it's preventing violence, it's social cohesion and benefits for all. And that's what we want under this national gender equality agenda.
Right, right. And my last question to you, Ms. Eversley, is how important is this National Gender Equality Policy and Action Plan to the attainment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2020, especially in relation to that of gender equality?
You know, our gender equality policy has three main goals, and those goals mirror the overall universal principles of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in drafting this policy, part of my instructions, Mr. Williams, were to ensure that the policy upholds obligations that the government of St. Kitts and Nevis has undertaken based on the conventions to which it is party and the agreements. And that is what we are seeking to do. So it is fundamental, and the policy goes hand in hand with achieving those SDG objectives as well as the objectives of other conventions to which the government is party. And we were careful to list those policies, sorry, those treaties, those international conventions, because you would be surprised to know that the government, the obligations under the Paris Agreement, for example, also contain gender equality conditions.
Right. Now,
That
Ms.
should be met,
Eversley,
I believe.
we are out of time, and is there anything else that you would like to say before we leave?
I just would like everyone to take some time. I know the Department of Gender will work towards a short version of the policy, and there is a lot more scope for discussion for people to share what concerns they have, but to also understand that the policy is clear in its objective for gender equality not to be perpetuated insofar as their actions, laws, practices that are unequal for women and men and boys and girls.
Ms. Eversley, I want to thank you so much. It has been a real pleasure speaking to you, and I see that this is something that you're very passionate about, and you've put a lot of work in it, and we really want to thank you for working along with the Ministry of Gender Affairs to bring to fruition this National Gender Equality Policy and Action Plan. And as it moves forward in terms of Cabinet's approval and it goes through the Parliament, we wish it every blessing and we wish you every blessing. Thank you so much, and I look forward to further engagement with you in forums like this, because as you correctly said, this policy has to be sold to the people. And it is only through information and education and through communication that people will understand how important a gender equality policy is towards the whole development of society. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And may I not leave without thanking the Director of Gender, Celia Christopher, and her team, because I have been following their instructions. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the Gender Coordinator in Nevis, Ms. Lorraine Archibald, and her team.
Thank you.
So together, this will be the national gender machinery in charge of oversight of the policy. So it's an exciting time. So that's why I'm excited to be part of this activity. Thank you so much.
Thank you and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.